Before joining Trout Unlimited's Wild Steelhead Initiative, he spent 3 years advocating for wild rivers and working on hydropower reform for American Rivers, a national river conservation organization. Prior to that, he spent 3 years managing advocacy campaigns and communication efforts for the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership. He also volunteered for 10 years on the board of directors for the Wild Steelhead Coalition in the role of president for 7 of those 10 years. Growing up fishing and floating the high country trout streams and rivers of Colorado, he landed for a brief spell in Missoula, Montana for grad school before finally settling in Seattle in 2008, where he was quickly seduced by the mystique of steelhead and the rivers of the Pacific Northwest. When he's unplugged, Jonathan is usually standing in a river with a fishing rod in hand and family in tow. So without further ado, Jonathan, you can go ahead and start sharing your screen.
How's it going, everyone? Let me get this started here. All right. All right, are we there?
Looks great. We can see just the slide.
Okay, perfect, awesome. All right, so yeah, as Bridget said, I'm Jonathan Stumpf. I work for the Wild Steelhead Initiative here at Trout Unlimited. I joined the team in March, right before the pandemic kind of settled in. So it's been interesting settling into this role in kind of this remote capacity. Previous to that, I was on the board of directors for the Wild Steelhead Coalition and spent about a decade working on steelhead issues throughout the state. Everything from establishing wild steelhead gene banks to working on reg changes. I participated in a variety of advisory groups as well. I was on the North Coast Steelhead Advisory Group in 2015, the Steelhead and Cutthroat Policy Advisory Group. So definitely have kind of, been through the ringer, so to speak, with WDFW advisory groups. So today I'm going to talk quickly about the Quicksilver Portfolio, and this was a product of the Puget Sound Steelhead Advisory Group that was formed in 2015. So I'll get into that here in a minute. All right, good transition there. Did that work?
Yes, looks great.
Okay, cool. So basically, I'm going to talk about quickly Puget Sound and the steelhead fishing. It had kind of a historical abundance of almost 500,000 winter and summer steelhead returning to the Puget Sound region. So that's all the way from the Elwha River all the way north to the Nooksack and the Drayton Harbor tributaries. Right now we're at about 5 to 10% of historical abundance, depending on the tributary. Back in the middle of the 20th century, going to the 80s and early 90s when things start to drop off, those are kind of the glory days of steelhead fishing. I got some pretty cool images in here. A lot of these vintage pictures that you see are courtesy of Tom Bailey's family. He was a past president of the Steelhead Trout Club. This clip of this article here is from Field and Stream issue in, I think, 1969, and it's really cool. You can see the fish on the left is a Skagit River fish, and then the fish on the far right is also a Skagit River fish. So back in the day when there was plenty of fish to go around and not too many anglers. So how did we get to this point right now where we have this, these dismal returns, 5 to 10% of historical abundance? There's a variety of factors. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the 4 H's. We have habitat and hydro. Habitat is identified as one of the biggest as like the leading limiting factor within the Puget Sound Recovery Plan. Hydro, here's a picture of the Howard Hanson Dam on the Green River. Habitat, kind of the endless logging practices that kind of happen throughout the region, throughout the watersheds. And then harvest and hatcheries had played a big problem with everything that has happened to the demise of Puget Sound steelhead. Just to kind of give you an example, here's a chart that was put together by Rich Sims from the Wild Steelhead Coalition. for some previous work that we did. And what you're seeing here is the Green River here in South Puget Sound, and the harvest rate and the hatchery plants. And you can kind of see both the harvest rate of those fish through the middle of the century was very high. We're talking like, anywhere from 6 to 13 or 11,000 fish. And then that white line through the middle there is the correlation with the hatchery plants that came in. And I think it was like the mid 70s is when those things really started to crank out those smolts. And then as we get into the 21st century, and everything there starts to drop off, both with the hatchery fish and then the overall harvest rate, and that got us to kind of the ESA listing. And then, of course, humans, right? Humans are a huge factor in this issue. We have about 2/3 of the, population of our state here in the Puget Sound region. So that's like, almost 4.5 million people living over, one of the past greatest fisheries that we had in our state. So in 2007, NOAA and NMFS determined that the Puget Sound distinct population segment of steelhead should be listed under the ESA. I think it was in June of 2007. And, soon thereafter, we started seeing those closures throughout Puget Sound. The Puyallup is closed, and the Nisqually's closed, the Stillaguamish is closed, the Green River is closed, the list goes on. And most of these winter fisheries that you can go fish on have, dwindling hatchery programs as well. So that kind of gets us to the present day. And, one of the big questions that was, kind of batted around by my colleagues at Trout Unlimited was, okay, so what are we trying to accomplish here? What can we do? What is a steelhead manager to do, given the divide in the community of steelhead anglers, and then of course the legal imperative to protect and sustain wild steelhead? And I think right about this time, it was 2016, the WDFW was beginning to move forward with the establishment of the wild steelhead management zones, or essentially hatchery-free rivers within the Puget Sound DPS. And I think at that time, the Elwha and the Nisqually were the two that were determined within the DPS, leaving the third one open for North Puget Sound. And about this time, John McMillan, our director of science, who I'm sure most of you are familiar with, and Rob Massanis, who is the VP of Western Conservation for Trout Unlimited, but also the founder of the Wild Steelhead Initiative, kind of came together and said, all right, like, what can we do? And this was that kind of question that they put together. There was a lot of division, there still is, within the steelhead community, whether it's gear type or hatchery or wild fisheries. And so they kind of just said, all right, like, let's figure this out. Let's kind of back it up a bit and go for the, portfolio approach. And that's how this was born. They said, why can't we kind of, manage these rivers on a wild and hatchery basis and look at the entire, Puget Sound DPS? So Rob Massanis, picked up the phone, and he had a conversation with one of his colleagues at the Coastal Conservation Association, Andy Marks, and he was very interested in this, and they got together and they took that idea to Jim Scott at the WDFW, and Jim thought it was a great idea, just a new way to approach kind of management for steelhead here in Puget Sound. So what is the kind of, the portfolio approach? The idea was, let's look at ways that we can, rebuild these fishable populations of wild steelhead in the most productive rivers. How can we provide diverse opportunities so, the anglers would have a reason to speak up for rivers and conservation, steelhead conservation, and then provide an opportunity to kind of conduct that critical research that would enable steelhead managers to make more informed decisions about the steelhead management. So, the monitoring, the evaluation, and the adaptive management. So Jim Scott decided to run with the idea, took it to his bosses at the WDFW, and the Puget Sound Steelhead Advisory Group was born. They brought in 13 members from a wide variety of the fish world. As you can see, here's the list of the 13 the 13 participants in the group. And this ranged from individuals that in groups and individuals that think the solution to our steelhead problems is to just go dump 1 million smolts in each river, to groups that think every river and hatchery should be closed. And so basically the goal of the PSSAG when we set out was just, develop this watershed specific kind of conservation, fishery and hatchery strategies for Puget Sound steelhead. And, so what we kind of came away with, and I'll get into here in a minute, was just a recommendation of an adaptive and experimental approach for the future of Puget Sound steelhead recovery and fisheries. And I think whether that was kind of an understanding, some of the things we were trying to get out was like, a better understanding of the genetic and ecological effects of hatcheries on wild steelhead, the impacts of sport fishing on wild steelhead, and then of course our overall collective ability to recover steelhead in the face of like the booming populations in the region, not to mention climate change. So, this product that we put together, we believe is kind of the opportunity to develop and implement kind of controlled experiments to help answer some of these questions. So basically, we kind of had this idea, like, as I mentioned, there's this kind of 3-tiered idea for what this portfolio would look like. And, generally the goal is the best remaining watersheds and steelhead populations would be reserved for, kind of wild only catch and release fisheries, while the other reef fisheries remain open for kind of sustainable and scientifically defendable harvest. And so we developed the Quicksilver Portfolio. And some of the, the considerations that we took into, some of the considerations that were brought to the table when we were developing this had to do with the, the steelhead populations, the fisheries, and the hatcheries. So first with the steelhead populations, we wanted to focus on recovery and the potential of these fisheries. So we wanted to improve the, the estimates of abundance, productivity, diversity, and spatial structure. One of the recommendations we have in here is getting at using sonar counts to, estimate the number of adult steelhead returning to some of these rivers. We also wanted to assess the survival of steelhead by life stage and identify the bottlenecks to improving the population status. Additionally, we wanted to kind of update the estimates of productivity and capacity of the habitat and then the steelhead populations and kind of modify the management objectives as appropriate. And then, of course, we want to evaluate and implement strategies to reduce pinniped predation in disease. As we know, that's a big problem here in Puget Sound. With regards to some of the considerations for the fisheries, we definitely wanted to account for the mortality of steelhead in all the fisheries, improve the estimates of mortality for the steelhead released in all fisheries, minimize the bycatch of the non-treaty commercial fisheries, and then monitor and adaptively management fisheries to kind of maximize the benefit, test assumptions, and make sure that we're considering the the Puget Sound steelhead recovery plan guidance. And then with regards to the hatcheries, we definitely wanted to test new and existing hatchery strategies. We wanted to incorporate assessments of the ecological impacts of these steelhead hatchery programs into their evaluation. We wanted to make sure that we were measuring the PHOS, the PHEC, and other measures of gene flow. And then prior to submitting the steelhead hatchery resource management plans for considerations by NIMS, requested review by the Hatchery Scientific Review Group. And they did actually go through and initially review this entire portfolio and send us back with some, very detailed comments. Let's see here. So again, here's kind of the 3 things that we were getting at to kind of limit risk and maximize the growth potential. we looked at establishing, wild steelhead catch and release fisheries, the wild steelhead broodstock hatcheries, and then the steelhead harvest hatcheries. Let's see here. Going on to the next one. All right, so kind of diving into what we have here. The one thing that we liked about this Quicksilver portfolio is that it recognizes the, kind of the reality of the conditions on the ground, and it identifies the, the conservation priorities and uses a diverse, geographically dispersed kind of set of wild steelhead populations, managed to be free of the effects of hatcheries. So as I mentioned earlier, the wild steelhead management zones. We're protecting kind of the wild steelhead by placing limits on key risk factors associated with these programs, providing a diversity of fishing opportunities, and then of course it must be implemented in a manner that's kind of consistent with the USV Washington, or what you guys probably know as the Bolt decision. And then some of the guiding documents we used in this process was the statewide steelhead management plan. We had the guidance of the Hatchery Scientific Review Group, and then of course the biological opinions for the DPS that were completed by NOAA in 2016 and 19. So kind of what you have here on the screen are, and I'm going to go into detail a little bit more, but these are what these three kind of specific fisheries would look like. So in the first column, we have the wild steelhead catch and release fisheries. These are managed exclusively for wild steelhead, where there's good habitat and the runs are relatively in good shape. And we wanted to provide, recreational catch and release opportunities that meets those conservation objectives and still has a, a limited impact on the fisheries. Some of those, you can see the list of some of the proposed locations right there. And then the big thing with this is the effective fishery monitoring, conservative fishing regulations, and then, making sure that there's high compliance with the recreational fishing rules, or, enforcement. And, we see that now in the Skagit River when that fishery is being prosecuted. And then second here is the wild steelhead broodstock hatcheries. And this is a guiding principle within the statewide steelhead management plan, is to get away from the segregated programs to more of these integrated programs. And so we looked at some of the basins at where we could use these broodstock hatchery programs to, as an effective tool kind of for the reintroduction and rebuilding of these runs, these depleted runs, and then possibly down the road move them to a catch and keep fishery. So some of these new proposed locations here, we have the Nooksack, the Cedar River, and the Skykomish. And then in that third column is the steelhead harvest hatcheries, and these are the classic segregated programs that used to be prolific or ubiquitous around Puget Sound with the Chambers Creek programs and the Skamania programs, and keeping some of these going, definitely implement these in a manner that limit the genetic and ecological effects to wild steelhead. And right now, the few that we have on there are mostly existing, although there are a few new ones that we are considering, and I'll get into those here in a minute. And so this whole process, just to kind of give you guys a sense of it, we started this in 2017, and I would say that we wrapped this up close to about the middle of 2020 or early 2020. We had presentations from about 40 different folks within NOAA and the WDFW, and we had a few other outside scientists come in. And we had to spend the first part of this process kind of going through these presentations, learning about the issues, learning what's at stake, where are the opportunities for recovering these wild populations, where are the opportunities for these, broodstock hatcheries, and where can we still continue our existing steelhead harvest hatcheries or the segregated programs. And, it was an interesting, process with so many different values and opinions and thoughts and considerations. And, you know, it definitely got heated, but I think this is a good example of consensus and collaboration. I mean, pretty much everyone, you know, kind of came away from the table not getting everything that they wanted, but a little bit of something. And, you know, in my opinion, that's a good example of, you know, kind of sitting down and hashing this out and collaborating and getting together and putting together this consensus-based package. So, you know, will this return us to the glory days of Puget Sound? Probably not, but with, you know, the goal of this is to start, you know, carefully experimenting with some of these watersheds where we can have, you know, these wild steelhead fisheries that are, you know, carefully monitored, and start implementing some of these broodstock hatchery programs, and then, you know, seeing if it's still possible to continue on with our segregated programs. And so I just put a few pictures in here from some of the glory days just to take a look at. So next here, I'm going to dive into the 3 MPGs, or the major population groups that are in Puget Sound, as I mentioned earlier. It's from the Elwha there on this map. That orange section is the Hood Canal, Strait of Juan to Fuca major population group. The blue section is the Central and South Puget Sound, and that runs from the Skykomish all the way up to, I believe, the Puyallup in the green. And then from the North Cascades, which is the green section, and that runs from the Snoqualmie Basin all the way to the border. And in this map too, there are 3 those brown sections, and those are not considered part of the DPS. In those 3 sections that you see there, it's the South Fork Sky, in the middle there, the bigger chunk on the very southern part by the blue is the Deschutes River, which flows into Olympia. And then of course, the South Fork of the Stillaguamish. All right, so here is kind of what we came up with on going through the various MPGs, just to give you an idea of some of the thoughts and recommendations that we put together. I'm not going to get too much into the science on this. If you guys want to talk more about that, definitely feel free to reach out and we can kind of get into the details on this. I'm really trying to keep this high level here. So just going into the Hood Canal and Strait of Juan to Fuca here, this is, in terms of the wild catch and release fishery, right now, obviously on the Elwha, all fishing is closed, both tribal, commercial, and sport and recreational. But that has been established as a wild steelhead management zone, and there is still a broodstock program right now that's helping with the recovery of those winter fish. I'm sure you all saw the video that Shane Anderson and TU put out earlier last year about the, you know, really amazing recovery of the summer steelhead in the Elwha. But the eventual goal here is that once the kind of the threshold has been met for the recovery objectives in the Elwha River, the hatchery would come offline, and that would return to a wild only river. And maybe someday down the road, we'll be looking at a wild steelhead catch and release fishery there. And then the other one that was brought into consideration, which would be new, is the Skykomish for a wild steelhead catch and release fishery. Right now, there is a broodstock program, a recovery program that is, I think, just started off last year on the North Fork of the Skykomish. And then the Dungeness program, that's a segregated program. And then one place that we did identify as a spot to potentially start a new segregated program was in the Quilcene River. There's the hatchery that's there right now, and it's a pretty limited number of fish that we kind of determined would be sufficient for that. So that is the Hood Canal, Strait of Juan to Fuca DPS. Here is the Central and South Puget Sound. Let's see here. So ideally, we would love to get to a wild catch and release fishery on the Green, the Puyallup, and the Nisqually. Up until a few years ago, those rivers were seeing kind of an upward trend. I think we got to about 2,200 fish in the Nisqually, maybe 1,800 in the Puyallup, and then close to 2,000 in the Green, although that started to tick down a little bit. But our recommendation is that once we get to that point, we can, potentially consider that as a spring fishery. We did recommend on the Sammamish River and the Sammamish Slough, which, long before my time, I guess that used to be a really good steelhead fishery. And that was a spot that we did consider for a new segregated program. And then currently, of course, there's a segregated program for winter fish on the Green. And then the other item on here that we had for a new segregated program was on the Deschutes River out of Olympia. The WDFW is right now looking for a spot to build a new salmon hatchery. And so the idea here is that we could possibly piggyback off of that with some steelhead. All right, and then finally the North Cascades. And the order that we're kind of running through this is the order that we went through this during the PSSAG, and that was kind of by design, just because we knew there was going to be a lot of discussion going into the Skagit River. So let's see here. Some of the recommendations that we had here for the wild steelhead fisheries were on the Nooksack, the Sammamish, the Skagit, and the Stillaguamish. One idea that we did have is to eventually transition away from the segregated winter program on the Nooksack and move that to a broodstock program on the Nooksack. So that is one of our recommendations. And then we also, of course, have the segregated programs on the Stillaguamish and the Snohomish. And then the other piece that is actually out for comment right now in the Snohomish system is the broodstock program for the summer fish on the Skykomish River. And the idea there is the program at Reeders, the Skamania, is going to be taken offline, kind of transitioned out, and they want to use fish from the South Fork Skykomish above Sunset Falls and use that to replace the Skamania program at the Skykomish River. And then, of course, the Skagit River. A majority, not a majority, but a good chunk of us within the group did push for that to be the wild steelhead management zone for the North Cascades. As I mentioned earlier, that was the only MPG that did not have a wild steelhead management zone established yet. And after, quite a few discussions, I mean, we had these meetings probably about once a month or once every other month, and we met for about 7 to 8 hours each day. I would say we probably discussed the Skagit for, it felt like a third of the time. And so what we did agree upon is that in the Skagit River, obviously we have a fisheries management plan with NOAA and the co-managers now that when it does meet a certain threshold within the forecast, we can have a fishery. But moving forward, the recommendation was to continue with no planting of hatchery fish for 8 years. So that would get us to, at the time, that would get us to 2028, at which point members of the advisory group or whoever would come back and reevaluate that. It went back and forth. Some people suggested 4 years. Some people said, let's just start planting fish. But we felt like 8 years is at the lowest point for us to make a determination of how those wild fish are going to be responding from the stopping of the hatchery plants, which I think stopped in 2015. So that's kind of where we are in terms of the recommendations. It's a lot of work. There are a lot of things that need to be considered moving forward with this. So kind of the next steps for this, we pre-COVID, we had a really rock solid plan. We presented to the director twice. We got his support. We presented to the commission twice. They were very enthusiastic about it. And, you know, going into 2020, we had put together our kind of initial implementation request of items that we wanted to, you know, get started with funding. That was just after the WDFW budget was made whole. And we felt like we were in good shape to actually get this funded. And then COVID hit and everything changed. So thankfully, the commission and the WDFW were, you know, very supportive of what we did. We scaled back what we were going to ask for, and included in the WDFW's budget and now the governor's budget. And it's, you know, the legislative session kicked off this week, so they'll be discussing that. We got 2 items in there. The first one is for population estimates. So looking at developing estimates of spawners for key populations of summer steelhead in the South Fork of the Nooksack, Deer Creek, and the North Fork of the Skykomish. And then the other one is kind of the fishery planning and monitoring. Initially, this was going to be used to, you know, look at and monitor the encounters of adult and juvenile wild steelhead that were being caught in some of these early hatchery program fisheries. But we have transitioned some of that funding over to future funding for the Skagit River fisheries moving forward. So that's where we are. TU has recently hired, as of this summer, we now have a full-time government affairs person working down at Olympia for us. His name is Alexei Kalambakaitis. He's a sharp guy. We're absolutely thrilled to have him on our team, and implementation of the Quicksilver portfolio is definitely high on our agenda items. So that's kind of what we have. Of course, I got to leave with the quote from the big guy here at Trout Unlimited, and this was kind of his vision. You know, I guess, Bridget, we can probably open that up for questions and see what people are thinking. And like I said, you know, this was a pretty high level view, but I'm happy to answer any questions about how we got here, or, you know, the timeline or anything like that. So thank you guys for having me tonight.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, for this presentation.
Yeah.
I think it was a good level of high level. I will open this up to questions, and folks feel free to unmute yourself. Here's my disclaimer though, just with some of the direct messages I've gotten throughout this presentation. Please be very tactful in your comments regarding tribal fishing. That's all I will say. I will mute you if I hear any unsuitable comments. So, David, your hand is raised in your video, so you can go first.
First, I want to thank Jonathan. I once attended a discussion about the Skagit on Cedar Woolley, and the WDFW person giving the presentation was not allowed to finish because everything was taken over by a number of very angry people. And I understand the difficulty that he's gone through. My first question is in regard to broodstock hatcheries integrated. I believe that the broodstock programs have been proven to be unsuccessful. They have initial success with increased numbers of fish, but in the long run, they have proven to reduce numbers of fish and have been harmful to the wild fish. An example would be the Snyder Creek broodstock program on the Salduck. In a totally different area, there was recent closing of a broodstock program for Atlantic salmon in Ireland, where the long-term proved that they were actually harming and decreasing the numbers of fish. So I'm wondering why the choice is to have these integrated programs started again when I think they've already been proven to be unsuccessful.
Yeah, so no, I absolutely get it. And, the one thing I'll say is that, going into this, like, obviously every group and every person at the table essentially said, we want to, we all have our own ideas of what we're trying to accomplish here, right? And, this is as I mentioned earlier too, the recommendation in the statewide steelhead management program is to move away from these segregated programs to these integrated programs. And so the way we looked at this, and this was one of the the exercises that we had to go through was essentially, I'm trying to think of the best way to explain this is, we had to sit down and look at the viability criteria for each of these MPGs and say, okay, like where in these spots, in these rivers, can we make sure that based on what we know with these programs that we'll have, the minimum effect on these populations and still be able to execute some level of these, broodstock programs. And so, it's a combination of the state trying to get away from the segregated program, from the segregated programs and move to these integrated programs. And so I'm with you, man. Like, I hear you. Like, these will probably be proven in the end. Like, okay, we tried this, it didn't work and it failed, and here we are. But in our mind, this is the best way for us to kind of move that forward away from the segregated programs into these integrated programs and give them a shot. And the other thing I will add too is that, it's not really identified specifically in the portfolio itself, but we do have, as I mentioned, this is an experimental approach. So we do have a lot of monitoring, evaluation, and adaptive management that's going to be built into these programs. It's not like we're just going to, say, all right, like we're going to the North Fork, or we're going to the Nooksack, and we're going to take out the segregated fish, and we're just going to dump in a ton of integrated fish and be done and walk away. And I get it. There's people in the group that thought, like, why are we risking, some of our, most troubled populations in the state with an approach like this. But after we kind of sat down and ran through the numbers and looked at the viability criteria and worked through this all, and this is the best thing that we could come away with. And of course, too, the other thing too, that at least gives me, that makes me feel a little bit better is that this program, like any program, is not just going to kick off and WDFW is going to be like, all right, we're good, we can walk away. I mean, these are still going to have to go through very thorough review with NOAA and the people at NIMS, right? It's going to have to go through the HGMP process. So there are some, sideboards and potentially backstops as well. So does that kind of answer your question a little bit?
It answers my question without making me feel very comfortable, but I expected that. And if I can, without dominating questions, I'd like to just make a few other comments. One of the things is in the regulations for the rivers with steelhead, the protections are focused on the adult returning fish, and they seem to forget that steelhead live in the river for 2 or 3 years, and they don't have, I don't think, adequate protections. Side streams that are used for fish for raising are open, and I mean, once upon a time, I was a kid who caught my limit of maybe 6-inch fish that were, I'm certain, smolts, steelhead smolts heading out. I think they need to do year-round protections for steelhead, and they can't just go to allowing all kinds of fisheries just because there are harvestable salmon, say, where they forget barbless hooks and they forget bait exclusions?
Yeah, no. I mean, that's a great point, David. I mean, that was actually one of the very first things that we kind of had in this implementation request, is to really monitor and look at the impacts to not only adult steelhead, but also juvenile steelhead from both, steelhead fisheries, but also from other fisheries such as salmon fisheries. And that's one thing too that we did not get into in this kind of first go around at this, is identifying what sport fishing regulations might look like when we do, consider opening some of these, possible new fisheries. And that's still something that's, in the hopper for us to sit down and discuss, right? So if we're going to open a wild steelhead winter fishery on the Skykomish River, it's not just going to be a wild steelhead fishery that's, selective gear and that's it. Like, we're really going to be thoughtful and, considerate about what we're trying to do and making sure that we're having a minimal impact on those fisheries. And then I hear you too about like, rainbow trout and, in steelhead smolts and things like that. So definitely, something that is kind of in consideration for this.
And, if I can make one more comment and then I'll stay quiet. And one of the other things that I think has been ignored is that steelhead exists with salmon. And when you don't have wild salmon bringing nutrients into the river systems, which has been the way steelhead existed for ages before we came upon things, to ignore wild salmon is limiting the potential for steelhead. And I think in all the rivers we're managing for wild steelhead, they really need to make more emphasis on wild salmon. And with that, I'll stay quiet.
No, I hear you though. I mean, I hear you. Those marine derived nutrients are, super important to the, to the recovery of these fish. And, that's why I almost think, and this is a much larger discussion, that, instead of just focusing on these wild steelhead management zones, we need to look at them as wild salmonid management zones.
I absolutely agree.
No, thanks for the questions, Dave, and comments. Appreciate it.
Ann, I'm going to go to you next. And before you start, Ann, folks, just make sure that you can, if you want to get in the queue to ask a question, you can use the raise hand feature. You can type something into the chat. But I'm not quite sure how many people have questions, so that would help give me an idea. But go ahead, Ann.
So real quickly, one thing I wanted to say, and this reminded me, Bridget, of what you said at the beginning of this Q&A session. The kind of next steps for us too, obviously we need to get funding through this with the legislature, but we also need to have some, very frank discussions with the co-managers in terms of these new hatchery programs, the existing hatchery programs, fishery management plans, things like that. So that's, another item that is on our list.
Yeah, lots of opinions there. So that was just my caveat, but thank you for addressing that.
Yep.
And go ahead.
Jonathan, can you speak to what is planned for the Samish? I wasn't aware that, number one, there were steelhead in it.
Yeah.
It's mostly a fishery for other than steelhead. So what are you talking about for the Samish?
So the Samish actually, so we're talking about a steelhead fishery. The Samish actually has a pretty stable population of wild returning steelhead. I think the last numbers I've seen are in the 600 to 800 range. It's a pretty small fishery. And so that was another one of the rivers that we potentially had as a possible wild steelhead fishery. And again, too, like I mentioned to David, it's not one of those things where we would say, all right, it's open, let's go do this. Some of the other considerations we talked about were, okay, do we need to, funding is a big thing for this, right? So maybe we should consider a Puget Sound, steelhead endorsement. So you pay an extra $25 or $30 if you want to fish any of these rivers. Or do we have to have a limited program, a lottery program for some of these smaller systems? But yeah, the Samish is identified as, one of the kind of stable populations within the region. And it does have a pretty, popular salmon fishery. And surprisingly, those steelhead have held on.
I mean, it's a combat fishing little baby small river.
Yeah.
And just the thought of not having to be a catch and take salmon river, I can just imagine the outrage.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, this wouldn't affect the salmon fishery, right? I mean, this would still be a steelhead fishery that, depending on kind of the run timing, it might be prosecuted through like, maybe a March 1 or March 15th, depending on that. But this is just one of the ideas that we, put out there as another, spot for opportunity.
So it'd be a different season is what you're saying.
Yeah, yep, totally.
Okay, thanks.
Yep, yeah.
Thank you. And then Erica, you have your hand up. You can go ahead and unmute yourself.
I think I unmuted myself. This is the first time I've ever done anything like this.
Well, welcome to the club.
Thank
doing great.
you. I'm very green. Let me just say that. And I don't even know what I look like. I feel horrible.
That's okay.
And
We
I have-
followed you're
I
not
have
on
a
video.
really bad internet service. I'm down actually by the harbor in Whatcom County. Just recently learning fish. Can you guys hear me?
You're cutting out a little bit.
Yeah.
Okay, here, wait. So can you hear me now? I feel like sometimes if I turn my internet on, it's not that great. And sometimes when I turn it off, it's better. Can you hear me?
We can hear you. You can go ahead and ask your question.
Okay, so I'm very new to fly fishing. I've actually posted, I feel like, on your website about I was actually at Lake Padden in Whatcom County in Bellingham, and I had a elderly lady come up to me and talk to me about the type of fishing that you guys do. So I'm more of a trout fisherman, and I just went to Montana and have caught a few trout in Montana on the Missouri River. But how do I shift from being a trout fisherman to what you got, like the double-handed rod, and figuring out other things besides just learning about fly fishing, I guess would be my question.
Yeah, and Erica, that's a great question. And I, for the sake of this meeting, I just want to see if folks have questions directly related to Jonathan's presentation, but I am happy to answer your question and like maybe have a dialogue via email. Would that work for you?
I would love that. And, I have actually been on the Nooksack River, and all these rivers that you guys are talking about are, I feel like, a lot of what I was raised in, so to implement something other than, and I call it a princess bobber fishing versus a fly fishing experience would be super cool. So I'm just grateful to be here and learn more about this experience. So thank you for that.
Totally. And Erica, I think I still have your contact on Facebook, so I'll send you an email, okay?
Thank you so much.
Cool. Any other questions for Jonathan?
One last thing that I'll say too is that the entire Quicksilver portfolio is available on the WDFW website. Just go to their site and do a search for Quicksilver Portfolio. We also have a blog post on wildsteelheaders.org that I did, I think back in June or July, that kind of went into detail and has a link to the report. There was a good story on Northwest Sportsman magazine, but that's where we are. So stay tuned with the implementation. We feel pretty good going into this session in terms of funding, but if we do need any voices or, letters sent to the legislators that hold the budget strings, definitely you guys are on the top of the list for chapters to come to.
Thank you. we like to remain engaged, as you might imagine. We're not totally excluded up here in the north corner of almost Canada. So
You just got to get more steelhead back to the region.
yeah. Well, I have a question for you, and this is kind of the question of the month, I suppose. What for the coastal steelhead, what's our prospect of getting a collaborative management approach like this one in the Puget Sound?
Yeah, no, totally. That's a great question. So as I mentioned earlier, I was on, a bunch of these other advisory groups. In 2015, I participated in the North Coast Steelhead Advisory Group, and that group was convened by the WDFW, kind of on the heels of Shane Anderson's film Wild Reverence. If you guys haven't seen that, please check it out. It's a great film that kind of gives a really high level of steelhead and their plight. But that movie and kind of a push by the Wild Steelhead Coalition, Wild Steelheaders United, was just coming online at the time. The department said, okay, we need to look at better sport fishing regulations for the West End, specifically the OP. And they formed the North Coast Steelhead Advisory Group. We got together in a room. It was the kind of same type of thing, except we were talking specifically about sport fishing regulations. And with that, when that group concluded, we came away with the ending of killing wild steelhead, which, was only 5 years ago. Selective gear, so no bait, barbless hooks through most of the season. They did have to roll back a little bit of that for the Springer fishery on the Hoe and the Quileute in like April and May. But otherwise, it was a good spot for us, and everyone was, really happy with that. The other piece that was added to that was no boat fishing, no fishing from boats on a 10-mile stretch of the Hoe, so from park boundary down to Morgan's. And we felt good about that. And there was a bunch of items that were left on the table. And, some of those were dealing with the co-manager agreements and co-manager harvest, redefining the escapement goals, assessing how some of those sport fishing regs were working, and looking at other ways to, address some of the limiting factors when it comes to harvest and hatcheries. And unfortunately, the individual from WDFW that was leading that group passed away, I think like a year or two afterwards, and kind of everything about that group went with them. And so there was a lot of items that were left on the table. Fast forward to 2020, I'm sure, or 2020, most of you have been paying attention. The department finally came around and said, okay, we want to implement a pretty strict set of new regulations to kind of limit, reduce our encounters with these fish by about 50 to 70%, but still maintain a fishery. And this is one thing that we've been pushing on them for a while, is that we need to, reconvene the North Coast Steelhead Advisory Group. And so we're trying to right now figure out what that looks like. The nice thing is that we're starting to hear that from a lot of people, that we need to get the band back together, so to speak. And whether it's some of the same people or a new approach is kind of yet to be seen. I think John McMillan and I are looking at other ways that we could potentially develop a recovery plan for the coastal populations without having to go down the road of an ESA listing when the feds come in, but ways that we can engage NOAA and NIMS and kind of get ahead of this. So that's kind of where we are. We're staying on top of James and Kelly, and it's kind of whack-a-mole right now with all the coastal reg stuff, but we'll keep you posted.
Please do.
Yeah.
It's I was pretty involved with that whole coastal steelhead regulation thing this season, and a lot of well, not a lot, but a few North NTU folks were kind of looking at me like, why do you care? It's out of our it's out of our range. And geographically speaking, yes, but those steelhead fisheries are very closely tied.
Yep. Yep, exactly. And and the other thing too, just real quickly talking about Puget Sound portfolio, I left that out, is like, in 2007 when the ESA listing happened, pretty soon thereafter, most of those fisheries closed. And you saw a lot of those guides and recreational anglers all migrate to the west end, to the Olympic Peninsula, to the Chehalis Basin. And those are kind of the only two fisheries that remain. So, another strategy with this is like, all right, if we can start maybe reopening some of these fisheries and limit the impact that we're having on the OP when everyone converges there at the, for the winter fisheries.
Right. All right. Any final questions for Jonathan?
No one asked about if the Skagit was going to be open this year.
I think we're afraid.
So I don't know if you guys have heard, but I think the run forecast is 4,800 fish this year for the Skagit. So that would allow a pretty limited fishery. I think the department right now is considering a 4-day-a-week fishery from February 15th to April 15th. They're trying to scrape together some funding for that, but that's to be determined. So we'll keep you posted. Obviously last year the forecast was 3,900 fish. It did come in at like 3,092. So well below that forecast. So yeah, I don't know. We'll have to see how that all shakes out.
Yeah, keep us posted on that. In the meantime, we'll just keep tying poppers and waiting until April. Just kidding.
And go bull trout fishing while you still can.
Yeah, there you go. Steve's the expert now on bull trout fishing, so. All right. Well, if no one has any other questions, I'm not seeing anything else in the chat or any hands raised. Tate, you're gonna have to unmute yourself, Tate.
Yeah, I guess I came up with a last second one. You were talking about the South Fork Nooksack and changes to monitoring, I think there. What is the current status of monitoring there, and what changes were you proposing?
So there's no monitoring happening right now with any of the summer populations, and that's why that's kind of one of the first things that we want to get at with this portfolio is understanding what those population estimates look like. So in the key summer populations, so that's the South Fork of the Nooksack, Deer Creek, and the North Fork of the Skykomish. And I think this past summer and fall, they did start some of that monitoring in the North Fork Skykomish, and that's just through snorkel surveys right now. And I think they eventually want to continue that in the South Fork Nook and in Deer Creek and go from there. So that's what I know about that.
Does that answer your question, Tate?
Yeah, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Sweet. Well, Jonathan, thank you so much for that presentation. That was amazing. I think I'm really proud to be part of a group of people who finds that stuff really fascinating, because I think in any other setting, in a lot of other settings, people would just be like a little too in the weeds, a little too steelhead nerds.
Yeah, no, I know. No, I appreciate it. You guys are kind of my guinea pigs. This kicks off my kind of chapter tour presenting this. So yeah, any feedback you guys have on this, shoot me an email. But yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you very much for having me. And like I said, if you have any questions that come to mind afterwards, give myself a shout, or reach out to McMillan and we can get those answered for you.
Awesome. Yeah, I put the website for Wild Steelhead Initiative, and it has contact info for all the folks involved there.
Oh yeah, cool. Awesome.
Yeah.
Oh, cool.
All right. Well, it was great to see everyone, and I'll just kind of hang out as people file out.
If you want, Bridget, I can put the quick link to the portfolio itself in the chat there.
That'd be perfect.
All right, hold on a second.
Steve Kopp, did you have anything you wanted to say to the chapter? Cope, sorry.
I was going to mention earlier, we were kind of talking about 2020 being a bit of a, crap show and whatever. And from the standpoint of the advocacy committee, I guess I just wanted to say, because I'm the advocacy chair for the chapter. First, want to say thanks to everybody who reached out to their representatives this year when you got an email from me or from somebody else. A couple of good things did happen last year. We did pass suction dredge mining reform in Washington to limit motorized suction dredge mining in special streams. So hopefully you're not going to see somebody running a motorized suction dredge in your favorite steelhead hole in the future. There was the passage of the Great American Outdoors Act, which was pretty significant. And I think we finally got the last nail in the coffin of the Pebble Mine project. So yeehaw, toast to everyone for that.
Also just got an introduction to the Roadless Area Conservation Act by Senator Maria Cantwell today. So you can Google that today too if folks are interested. Not a TU specific project, but.
Wait, say that again, Bridget, real quick.
Maria Cantwell introduced the Roadless Area Conservation Act of 2020.
Oh, nice.
Today.
Awesome.
Yeah. So, and that does have impacts for roadless areas in Washington.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, and I don't want to be too much of a downer.
Then I'll mute you. Just kidding. Chris, you can unmute yourself.
Yeah, sorry, I muted the wrong screen. But Pebble's Pebble's dying, but it's not dead. I don't want us to give up on that push. The governor of Alaska is trying to, keep it alive, and let's hope that in the next 4 years we can kill it for good. It was good news that it's, got shot in the head.
Yeah, I would agree on that. It's not completely dead, but it's more dead than it's been. So
Shocking that it happened when it did. So take it as good news, but don't give up on it.
Yeah.
Good point. We will keep an eye on it. Cool. Anything else? I think we're good. But yeah, thanks again, Jonathan. And if folks have questions, I can also selectively share Jonathan's contact info if you need. But otherwise, everyone take care. It was good to see you.
Cool. Thank you, guys. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Jonathan.
Yeah, no problem. My pleasure. Take care. Have a good evening.